All right, we're going to continue in our reading. He's at Poetry's house for like a half an hour, and he's supposed to go home. But do you know, I forgot all about not staying longer than a half an hour. I know that's no excuse, but I did forget, and I didn't do it on purpose. After we'd given the pail of berries to his mother, we went out to his tent under the big maple tree. "There's something I want to show you," Poetry said. "I mentioned before that all the gang were collecting shells that summer. Well, Circus had maybe the best collection of all, except maybe Little Jim. Of course, there wasn't a large variety of shells to be found along Sugar Creek, but we had relatives who lived in different places, and they sent us shells. Poetry had an orange scallop and 2.5 inches high, and a reddish-brown scallop 6 inches high, from under which his uncle had sent him from the Atlantic Ocean, and a knobbed whelk, which is shaped like a pear from Texas, and a little moon shell, and a periwinkle, and a greenish-brown squawfoot, and a greenish-brown washboard. I had a lot of washboards myself because there were hundreds of them in the riffles in Sugar Creek. Sometimes there were even pearls in them. We had to memorize the poem, The Chambered Nautilus, in school last year. The pearly nautilus is a big shell that crawls on the bottom of the ocean in the South Seas, and the chamber is its shell. "Want to see my new hobby?" Poetry asked. He pulled a big scrapbook out of a desk drawer and began showing me pictures of a lot of important men and women. He had one section of his scrapbook for famous missionaries, another for evangelists, another for pastors, another for Christian writers and evangelistic singers, and doctors and nurses. He was just beginning to make the collection, but it certainly looked interesting. All of a sudden, Poetry's mother called from the house that dinner was ready. Dinner? I was supposed to stay only a half an hour. In 2 jiffies, I was gone with the wind. When I got home, Mom and Dad were sitting at the table eating. They hadn't even waited for me. "Hello," I said cheerfully, having been especially careful not to forget to wash my face and comb my hair. Then, to keep them from being disgusted with me, I began telling them about Poetry's new hobby. But do you know what? My folks never said a word. Everything was quiet, and I had the strangest feeling inside. When I looked at Dad, he just kept his face straight with his big blackish red eyebrows half up and half down, and Mother looked sad. "What's the matter?" I asked innocently. "Is little Charlotte Ann sick or something?" "Charlotte Ann's okay," Dad said. There was a rule in our house not to talk about anything unpleasant at the table, so we didn't, but just the same, I didn't like the atmosphere. It was a good dinner, though. Pork and beans and bread and butter and blackberry pie. "I'm sorry," Mom said when it came time for dessert, "but we've done everything we can to help you not to be forgetful, none of which seems to do any good. Your father and I have decided not to scold you or punish you this time. You are not generally disobedient, but you are very thoughtless. So, to help you remember, we're asking you to leave the table now without eating any dessert." Her voice was very sad, and so was her face. I had my mouth all set for that blackberry pie, liking it maybe better than anything else. Anyway, I did right that minute. So when she said that, all of a sudden something in me turned as hot as fire, and I started to talk back. I don't know what made me do it. I know it was wrong all the time, but I was angry. Dad's eyebrows dropped low and his jaw set, and he said, "You're excused, William Jasper Collins," which was the name I hated. I shut up the way a washboard clam down along Sugar Creek shuts up when you start to touch it. But then I said, "I don't want any old pie anyway." I didn't tell them I'd had some at Poetry's house, or they wouldn't have thought I was getting a good punishment. I left the table. "Furthermore," Dad said, "you're going to remember to shut the gate from now on so the pigs won't get out. And you're going to be a little more cheerful about helping me around the house," Mom said. "And you're not going swimming this afternoon," Dad's big voice thundered. I went outdoors without saying anything more. I knew they were right. I didn't obey very well, and I wasn't always cheerful when I did. I knew it was a sin to talk back to my parents, and it wasn't right to be so forgetful all the time, because being thoughtless is the same as being selfish, and selfishness is sin. On top of that, I was supposed to be a Christian. In fact, I was, but I didn't always act like one. I was so disgusted with myself that I picked up a rock and threw it at our old red rooster. And would you believe it? The old rooster got in the way, and the rock hit him and broke his leg. And we had to have chicken for dinner that next day. That only made matters worse. I went out to the barn, climbed up in the haymow. Old Mixie Cat was up there, and I yelled "Scat!" at her. She jumped as if she was shot and scooted across the hay and down the ladder. Then I threw myself down on the hay and cried and felt sad and wished I'd run away and never come home again. I even wished I was dead. All of a sudden, I felt something hard on my hip. It was something in my pocket. I took it out to see what it was, and it was my little black leather New Testament. I sat there looking at it, and the next thing I knew, I was terribly sorry. And I got to thinking maybe God still liked me. So I kind of half cried the whole story to him and asked him to please do something about Bill Collins being so stubborn and so forgetful. Chapter 5. It was little Jim who helped me fix up things with my dad. Mom forgave me right away without me even asking her when I went into the house and started helping her. But whenever I looked at Dad, he looked the other way or straight in front of him. It hurt terribly not to be able to go swimming with the gang, but it hurt worse not to have my dad like me anymore. Along about 2:15, when I was out in the garden hoeing and feeling sad and with a little dust getting mixed with my tears, little Jim came along. The gang had sent him up from the spring to see why I hadn't come or if I was sick, which I wasn't. I had to tell somebody, so I told little Jim all about it. He felt very sad, very sorry for me. He stood there digging his bare toes into the ground and scooping up little piles of dirt on the back of his foot and kicking them across the garden while I talked. Every now and then he'd stoop and pull a weed and let me know he sympathized with me. And then he told me the best story, and it gave me an idea how I could get Dad to like me again. You see, little Jim's mom knew all about the famous musicians, and she told him interesting stories about different ones. Why don't you do what Walter Damrosch did once when he wanted his father to forgive him for something wrong he'd done? Little Jim asked. Walter Damrosch, was once the director of the New York Symphony Orchestra, and little Jim's mom had taught him a lot of things like that. Well, one day when Walter was a little boy and he had had a spanking for being naughty, he wanted to ask his father to forgive him, but he was afraid to. So he drew a sad picture of himself standing at his father's door. Underneath the picture, he printed the words, 70 times 7 shalt thou forgive. Then he shoved it under the door of the room where his father was and waited. Pretty soon his dad came out and it was all right. I guess you know the Bible story of how Peter once asked the Lord how many times we ought to forgive anyone who sins against us. 7 times, Peter asked, and Jesus said, not 7, but 70 times 7. Well, when little Jim told me that story, it made me feel better, and I decided to try it. What'll I tell the gang? Little Jim wanted to know. They told me to hurry right back. Tell them I have to work, I said. Little Jim started to run back to the gang. Then he stopped and said, Circus seems awful happy today. I'm glad he's saved, aren't you? It just makes me feel all clean inside, kind of like a jackrabbit running through the woods. And then that little fellow tumbled over the fence and away he ran, looking like a jackrabbit himself as he galloped back to the gang. I sighed a great big sigh and looked out across the green cornfield to where Dad was plowing and wished I was right there beside him. I'll bet he's thirsty, I said to myself. So I went to the house and got a small jug of water and a pencil and paper. The picture I drew of myself was sad, all right, only it looked more like a lonesome cow than it did me. I wrote at the bottom the words 70 times 7. Then punched a hole through the paper, and with a piece of string tied it to the handle of the water jug. Then I went through the gate and down to the field where Dad was working and waited for him to get to the end of the row. The corn was almost knee-high already, and it was only the 1st of July. Even the corn looked sad, I thought. We need a good rain. All the ends of the blades were rolled because of the heat, and there was a big cloud of dust almost hiding my dad and the team of horses and plow. The nearer he came to the end of the row, the faster my heart beat, and it seemed like it would burst for hurting me so much. Pretty soon he stopped the horses, and I ran down between the corn rows and handed him the jug of water with the note tied to it. "Maybe you're thirsty," I said, not looking up at him. As soon as he had the jug in his hand, I turned and ran as fast as I could toward the barn. When I got inside, I looked back and watched him through the crack in the door, my heart beating and hurting like everything. I even prayed, "Please, make him forgive me." Then I walked through the barn and out another door and went back to hoeing potatoes just as hard as I could, with my back to the cornfield so I couldn't see. I was singing